The rain over Manhattan came down like static, blurring the neon signs of Mulberry Street into smears of red and gold. Inside La Notte, the private dining room reserved for men who did not exist on any guest list, Damien Marchetti sat with his back to the wall, as he always did, and studied the faces of men who called him friend. He trusted none of them. "To family," said Rico Belandi, lifting his glass of Barolo, his gold rings catching the candlelight. "And to peace with the Castellanos." Damien did not lift his glass. He watched Rico's hand instead, the faint tremor in it, the way his eyes flicked toward the kitchen door a half-second too long. 20 years in this business had taught him that men who were about to betray you always looked at exits. "Peace," Damien said quietly, "is a word men use right before they reach for a knife." Rico laughed, too loud, too fast. "You've gotten paranoid in your old age, Damien." "I've gotten old because I'm paranoid." The lights went out at 9:47 p.m. Not a blackout, surgical, deliberate, the kind of darkness that came from a man cutting power to a specific circuit at a specific time. Damien was already moving before the first shot cracked through the black, his body dropping beneath the table on reflex trained into his bones since he was 19 years old, and his father had first told him, "The moment you hesitate is the moment you die." The room exploded into chaos. Glass shattered. A woman screamed somewhere near the bar. Muzzle flashes lit the dark in violent, stuttering bursts, and Damien felt the bullet before he understood it. A punch of fire tearing through his side just above the hip, spinning him half around, his shoulder slamming into an overturned table. He heard Rico shouting his name. He heard, dimly, through the ringing in his ears, the particular cadence of a Castellano soldier's voice, barking orders in Sicilian dialect. "So it's them," he thought, distantly, as if observing his own murder from a great height. "Of course it's them." His bodyguard Tomas got an arm under him, hauling him upright, blood slicking down Damien's shirt in a hot river that seemed to have no end. The world tilted. The gunfire kept coming, wild and undisciplined now. The shooters, realizing their target was moving, was still alive, was being dragged toward the service exit through a kitchen that smelled of scorched garlic and cordite. "Boss, stay with me," Thomas was saying, again and again, his voice cracking with something Damien had never heard from him before. Fear. "I'm not going anywhere," Damien said, though the words came out slurred, wrong, his mouth full of copper and static. The alley outside was black rain and red tail lights. Someone was screaming into a phone. Damien's vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges eaten away by a darkness that had nothing to do with the storm. He thought, absurdly, of his father's hands, of the smell of his mother's kitchen when he was 6 years old, of a debt his family had carried for 30 years that he had never once been permitted to forget. "Not like this," he thought, "not before I understand why." Then there was nothing. The gurney burst through the ambulance bay doors of Mercy General at 10:14 p.m, wheels shrieking against wet linoleum, paramedics shouting vitals that were already deteriorating. "Male, mid-30s, GSW to the abdomen and thigh, BP 80/40 and dropping. We've got 2 litres of fluid in, he's crashing." Dr. Elena Ricci was already moving before the doors finished swinging, her white coat abandoned somewhere behind the nurses' station, scrubs bare beneath it, dark hair pulled back so tight it pulled at her scalp. She had been on shift for 11 hours. She would be on shift for 6 more before this night was done. "Talk to me," she said, falling into step beside the gurney, 2 fingers already at his throat, checking a pulse that fluttered like a dying bird. Multiple GSW, no ID, no name, some kind of restaurant shooting on Mulberry. I don't need his biography, I need his blood pressure. Elena's voice was flat, precise, cutting through the noise the way a scalpel cuts through skin, without hesitation, without apology. Trauma 2, now. She had seen 1,000 bodies come through those doors. Gunshot wounds were, unfortunately, not rare in a New York City emergency room, and Elena had long since trained herself not to look at faces, not to wonder about the men and women whose blood she held between her hands. A patient was a puzzle of vital signs and failing organs, nothing more. It was the only way to survive this job with her heart intact. But something made her look at this one's face as they wheeled him under the trauma bay lights. He was strikingly, almost unfairly handsome, even now, even grey with blood loss, even with his jaw slack and his lips bloodless. A face carved with hard, aristocratic lines, dark hair damp with rain and sweat, a scar through one eyebrow that spoke of violence long before tonight. There was something in the stillness of him, even unconscious, even dying, that felt less like weakness and more like a held breath, like a man who had simply chosen, for the moment, to stop fighting. "BP's 60 over palp, he's losing it. Cut the shirt, I need to see the entry wound." Elena's hands were already working, gloved fingers pressing gauze against the wound in his side, feeling the wet heat of arterial bleeding pulse against her palm. "He's bleeding into his abdomen. I need surgery, now. Call it. We don't have time to wait for imaging." "Dr. Ritchie, we don't have consent. We don't even have a name. He doesn't need to consent to not dying," Elena snapped. "Move." They moved. The next 40 minutes existed for Elena the way they always did during a trauma like this. Not as a sequence of events, but as a single, elongated moment of total focus, the outside world falling away until there was nothing but the wound, the bleeding, her hands, and the numbers on the monitor that told her, second by second, whether she was winning or losing. She found the bleeder in his abdomen, a nicked branch of the splenic artery, and clamped it with hands that did not shake, though her own heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. She packed the wound, she called for more blood. She watched his pressure climb, fall, climb again, and somewhere in the middle of it, in a moment she would never admit to anyone, she found herself murmuring to him under her breath. Not prayers, she didn't believe in those, but something close to it. "Stay with me," she said, so quietly none of the nurses could have heard over the monitors. "Whoever you are, stay." At 11:52 p.m., his blood pressure stabilized. At 12:03 a.m., the surgical team took over, and Elena Ricci stepped back from the table, blood to her elbows, and allowed herself for exactly 4 seconds to close her eyes. She did not know his name. She did not know that the man breathing on the table in front of her commanded more fear in 5 boroughs than the NYPD commissioner himself. She did not know that 4 men were already dead in an alley off Mulberry Street for having failed to finish what they started. She only knew that she had done her job and that something about this particular stranger had made her fight harder than she had fought in a very long time. He woke to white light and the smell of antiseptic, and for a long moment Damien Marchetti did not know if he was alive or if this was simply what death looked like for a man who had spent his whole life being told he was going to hell. Pain arrived before memory did, a deep, grinding ache low in his side, the pull of stitches when he tried to shift his weight. Machines beeped somewhere near his head. A drip line ran cold fluid into the back of his hand. He lay still, eyes barely open, and did what his father had taught him to do in any unfamiliar room. He listened. Footsteps in the hallway. A cart being wheeled somewhere. The low murmur of a television. No voices raised in alarm, no urgency in the air. Wherever he was, it wasn't a trap. Not yet. "You're awake." The voice was calm, low, edged with the particular fatigue of someone who had been awake far too long. Damien turned his head and found her standing at the foot of his bed, a tablet in her hands, dark eyes assessing him with the same clinical detachment she might have given a lab result. She was younger than he expected, late 20s maybe, dark hair escaping its knot in loose strands around a face that had no business being this striking in the middle of a night shift. Sharp cheekbones, a mouth set in a hard line that suggested she rarely smiled at men like him, and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the fluorescent light rather than reflect it. There was a smear of something, iodine maybe, or dried blood, along her jaw that she clearly hadn't noticed. "Where?" he said, and stopped, his throat raw as sandpaper. "Mercy General. You've been out for about 14 hours. She moved closer, checking the monitor above his head without looking at him, professional to the point of coldness. "You took 2 bullets. One nicked your splenic artery. That's the one that almost killed you. You're lucky. Or your surgeon was very good." "Possibly both." "Which one were you?" Something flickered behind her eyes, surprise, maybe, that he'd asked. "I was your attending in the ER. I stabilized you before the surgical team took over." She paused. "You don't have a name in our system. No ID on you when you came in. Do you want to tell me who you are, or should I keep calling you John Doe?" Damien's mind, even fogged with morphine, was already working 3 moves ahead. No name, no ID. Whoever had gotten him here had had the presence of mind to strip him of anything that could identify him before the ambulance arrived. Thomas, probably, or Vincent, moving fast in the chaos to protect him from exactly this moment, a hospital room full of strangers who might call the police, or worse, might call the Castellanos. "Marco," he said. Marco Conti. It wasn't true. It didn't need to be. She studied him for a moment longer than the lie deserved, and he had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of being seen. Not looked at, not assessed, but seen. The way a woman might look at a man and understand instantly that he was lying to her, and choose, for reasons of her own, not to press it. "Well, Mr. Conti," she said, "you're going to need to stay for observation for at least another day. Whoever did this to you did a thorough job. Another inch and you wouldn't be having this conversation." "But I am." "You are." She made a note on the tablet. "Any family we should call? Anyone waiting for you?" 200 men, Damien thought, and none of them know if I'm alive. "No one," he said instead. "I'm alone." Something in his voice must have carried more truth than he intended, because she looked up from the tablet again, and for just a moment the clinical mask slipped, not far, not long, but enough that he saw something almost like sympathy pass behind her eyes before she caught it and put it away. "Get some rest, Mr. Conti," she said, moving toward the door. "I'll check on you before my shift ends." "Doctor," he said before she could leave, "what's your name?" She paused in the doorway, backlit by the hall lights, and for reasons he would spend the next several weeks trying and failing to articulate even to himself, Damien found that he needed to know the answer more than he had needed anything in a very long time. "Dr. Ricci," she said. "Elena Ricci." The name hit him like a second bullet. He kept his face perfectly, professionally still. 20 years of sitting across tables from men who wanted him dead had taught him to control every muscle in his body, to give away nothing. And he gave away nothing now, even as his heart slammed once hard against his ribs. Ricci. It could be nothing. It was a common enough name, common as Rossi or Russo, and there was no reason on God's earth that the woman who had just saved his life should share a surname with the man his father had spoken of only twice in Damien's entire childhood, always in a hushed voice, always with something that looked, on his father's hard face, uncomfortably like reverence. "Antonio Ricci saved my life once. A debt like that, you don't forget. You don't ever forget." "Ricci," Damien repeated aloud, testing the shape of it. "Common name. Common enough." She smiled, faint and professional, the first smile she'd given him. "Get some sleep, Mr. Conti." The door swung shut behind her, and Damien lay in the dark, pain forgotten, staring at the ceiling with the particular stillness of a man who had just watched the entire architecture of his life, quietly, invisibly, begin to shift beneath him. He needed to know if it was true. He needed to know if fate, or something far more deliberate than fate, had placed him in the hands of the one woman in New York City whose blood carried a debt that predated his own birth. And beneath that need, buried under 30 years of discipline and violence and the particular numbness that came from a life spent expecting betrayal, something else stirred. Something he did not have a name for yet. Something that felt disturbingly like hope. By morning, Vincent Salerno had found him. Damien's consigliere arrived at Mercy General, wearing the grey suit of a man visiting a sick relative, no bodyguards visible, though Damien knew there were at least 3 stationed within 100 yards, and sat down in the chair beside the bed with the particular stillness of a man who had aged 60 years in the last 12 hours. "You look like hell," Vincent said. "I feel like I've been shot twice." Damien's voice was stronger now, though the pain still throbbed low and constant beneath the morphine. "Tell me what happened." "Castellanos." Vincent's jaw tightened. "Rico's dead. 2 of our men are dead. The shooters got away clean. Professional crew, not local talent, which means Salvatore Castellano paid real money for this. He's declaring war. He's testing you, seeing if the great Damien Marchetti bleeds like the rest of us." Vincent leaned forward, voice dropping. "The good news is, nobody outside our people knows you're the one who got hit. Officially, John Doe took 2 bullets in a bar shooting on Mulberry. The hospital doesn't have your name. The cops don't have your name. As far as the world knows, Damien Marchetti wasn't even there last night. I told them my name was Marco Conti." Vincent's eyebrows rose slightly, the closest he ever came to open surprise. Why? Damien didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, "The doctor who worked the ER when I came in, Elena Ricci. Find out everything about her family, specifically her father." Vincent's expression shifted, quick and sharp. The same recognition Damien himself had felt hit him a moment later. "Ricci," he repeated. "You think—" "I don't think anything yet. That's why I'm asking you to find out." It took Vincent 6 hours. He returned that evening with a manila folder that he did not open in front of the nurses, waiting instead until they were alone, the door shut, the blinds drawn against the city lights. Dr. Elena Ricci, 31, attending physician in emergency medicine at Mercy General for the last 4 years. Top of her class at Columbia Med School. No husband, no children, lives alone in an apartment in Murray Hill that costs more than her salary should allow, which tells me her family has money somewhere, even if she doesn't spend it on herself. Vincent flipped a page. Her father is Dr. Antonio Ricci, retired trauma surgeon. Used to run a private practice out of a clinic near Little Italy back in the 80s and 90s. The kind of clinic that didn't ask questions when men came in with bullet wounds and cash instead of insurance cards. Damien's hand went still against the blanket. 31 years ago, Vincent continued, his voice dropping lower, your father was ambushed outside a warehouse in Red Hook. Took a bullet through the chest. Collapsed lung. Should have died in the car on the way to any hospital that would have turned him away for the police report alone. Instead, his men brought him to a private clinic 3 blocks from where it happened. A young surgeon named Antonio Ricci operated on him in the back room, off the books, no questions asked, and saved his life. I know the story, Damien said quietly. My father told it to me twice in my life, once when I was 12 and once the week before he died. He told me the Ricci family carried our gratitude, whether they wanted it or not. That if the day ever came when a Ricci needed the Marchetti name, they would have it, no question, no hesitation. And now his granddaughter just saved your life the same way. Vincent closed the folder. That's not a coincidence, Damien. That's not fate either. That's a man who's never once forgotten a debt, keeping his family close to yours for 30 years without either side knowing it. Damien stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Outside, rain had started again, tapping soft and insistent against the window glass. My father never told her family that we were watching, he said slowly, understanding dawning even as he spoke it aloud. He wanted the debt honoured without ever making them feel obligated. He probably steered business their way, made sure the clinic got protection, made sure nothing bad ever touched that family. All without them ever knowing why. And somewhere in that quiet arrangement, Vincent said, his granddaughter grew up to be an ER doctor at the exact hospital where you'd end up dying, unless she saved you. Twice this family has kept a Marchetti alive without knowing what they were doing. Something moved through Damien's chest that he did not have adequate language for. Not gratitude alone, though that was part of it, and not simple fascination, though God knew that was part of it too. It was closer to a kind of vertigo, the sensation of a man who had spent his entire adult life believing he understood the architecture of fate and violence that governed his world, only to discover a hidden room he'd never known existed. She doesn't know, Damien said. Any of it. No reason she should. I want to keep it that way. Damien's voice hardened, the pain in his side forgotten in the sudden, absolute clarity of decision. She saved my life without knowing who I am or what I owe her family. I don't want her gratitude built on obligation. I don't want it built on fear either, once she understands what I am. Vincent studied him for a long moment, and something in his old friend's face told Damien that Vincent understood exactly what he was hearing, even before Damien himself had fully admitted it. "You want to know her," Vincent said, not a question. "I want to repay a debt," Damien said. It was not entirely a lie. It was not entirely the truth either. Vincent's mouth curved, faint and knowing, the closest thing to a smile Damien had seen from him since the shooting. "Damien, in 30 years I have never once seen you look at a woman the way you looked at that door when she left this room this morning. You weren't here this morning. I have people everywhere, Damien. You know that." Vincent rose, tucking the folder beneath his arm. "Be careful. A man like you falling for a woman like her, that's not a love story. That's a liability with a heartbeat, and the second the Castellanos find out she's the one who put you back together, she becomes a target, whether you touch her or not." Damien said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make the warning less true. But as Vincent left and the room fell quiet again, Damien found himself thinking not of the Castellanos, not of war, not of the empire he had spent his entire adult life building and defending, but of dark eyes that had seen straight through his lie, and a voice that had called him back from wherever the dying go, murmuring words he had barely heard and would never, for as long as he lived, forget. "Stay with me, whoever you are. Stay." He intended to. Elena did not think about Marco Conti for the 3 days after his discharge. She told herself this often enough that it might have become true, if not for the fact that she found herself glancing toward room 412 every time she passed it on her rounds, even after the bed had been stripped and reassigned to a woman recovering from a car accident. There had been something about him. She recognized the shape of the feeling, if not its cause, the particular unsettled curiosity a doctor sometimes carried for a patient whose story had gone unfinished, whose ending she would never know. Except it wasn't only curiosity, and she knew it wasn't only curiosity, because curiosity did not usually keep a woman awake at 2 a.m. remembering the low, rough timbre of a stranger's voice asking her name, like it mattered more than anything else in the room. "You're being ridiculous," she told herself, standing in her kitchen at midnight after another double shift, pouring wine into a glass she was too tired to actually drink. "He gave you a fake name. He's probably exactly the kind of man your mother warned you about, the kind who gets shot in a restaurant and vanishes into the night without so much as a thank you card." Except he had left a thank you card, in a manner of speaking. 3 days after his discharge, an enormous arrangement of white peonies arrived at the nurse's station, addressed simply to Dr. Ricci. No note, no return address, the flowers themselves so clearly, extravagantly expensive that the charge nurse, Priya, had whistled low under her breath and said, "Girl, whoever that John Doe was, he's got taste and money." "It's probably nothing," Eleanor said, though she'd found herself smelling the peonies for a full minute before setting them on her desk. It was not nothing. 2 days after that, an anonymous donation of $40,000 arrived at Mercy General's trauma department, earmarked specifically for new equipment in the emergency bay, submitted through a shell foundation that even the hospital's administrators delighted as they were, couldn't quite trace to a source. Elena told herself this had nothing to do with her. She told herself this while standing in the equipment room, admiring the new portable ultrasound machine that the donation had purchased, running her hand along its sleek casing with a small, private smile she didn't examine too closely. She did not know that 3 floors below the hospital, in a black car idling at the curb, a man in a dark coat sat watching the entrance with the patient, unhurried attention of a predator who had already decided, somewhere in the quiet architecture of his own mind, that this particular pursuit was worth every risk it carried. Damien had been discharged for a week and had not once returned to Mercy General in person. He didn't need to. He had people for that, a private investigator named Frank Delgado, who specialized in the kind of discreet, thorough surveillance that never left a trace, and who had, within 4 days, produced a dossier on Elena Ricci's habits, so complete that Damien felt he could have predicted her schedule down to the minute. She ran every morning at 5:30 a.m. along the East River when she wasn't on shift, 3 miles, always the same route. She drank her coffee black from the same cart on 34th Street, always tipped the vendor $5 regardless of the total. She visited her father every Sunday without fail, taking the subway to Bensonhurst rather than driving, though she could clearly afford a car service. She had not been on a date, according to Delgado's careful research, in over 8 months. She worked more hours than any 3 other doctors in her department combined, and she never, not once in 4 years, had called in sick. She's not just good at her job, Delgado had told him, sliding the folder across the desk of Damien's penthouse office. She's obsessed with it. The kind of doctor who takes every death personally. There's a rumor at the hospital that she lost someone when she was younger, a patient, or maybe someone closer than that, and that it's why she pushes as hard as she does. Damien had said nothing, only turned the pages slowly, studying a photograph of Elena laughing with a colleague outside the hospital entrance, her head thrown back, dark hair loose for once, instead of pulled tight into its severe knot, and felt something twist low in his chest that he recognized, with some discomfort, as tenderness. He was not a man given to tenderness. He had built his entire life on the opposite of it, on precision, control, the calculated application of fear as a tool of governance over an empire that did not run on kindness. And yet here he was, 3 weeks after nearly dying on a stranger's operating table, sitting in the dark of his own penthouse, with a folder of photographs of a woman he had spoken to exactly twice, feeling something he had not felt since he was young enough to believe love was something other than a weakness to be exploited. "You want me to arrange contact?" Delgado asked. "I can put you in her path. Coffee cart, her gym, easy enough." "No." Damien closed the folder. "I don't want to manufacture anything with her. Whatever happens between us, it happens because she chooses it, not because I engineered it." Delgado raised an eyebrow but said nothing further. He had worked for Damien Marchetti long enough to know when a subject was closed. That night, Damien stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, 40 stories above a city that both feared and depended on him, and looked out at the lights of the east side, glittering like scattered coins across the dark water, and thought about a woman running along that same river every morning at 5:30, alone, disciplined, carrying some private grief he did not yet understand. "I will find a way into her life," he thought, "that does not require a single lie beyond the one I've already told." It was, he knew even as he thought it, an impossible promise, but it was the promise he intended to keep. The coffee cart on 34th Street was run by a stooped, cheerful Dominican man named Hector, who had, over the 4 years Elena had been buying her morning coffee from him, become something like a friend. The kind of casual, low-stakes friendship built entirely on routine and small kindnesses, the sort that made a hard job feel slightly less lonely. "Dr. Ricci!" Hector called out as she approached on a grey Tuesday morning, exactly 11 days after Marco Conti's discharge. "Your usual. And today you got competition. This gentleman's been asking about the best coffee in the neighbourhood." Elena glanced sideways, expecting nothing, and felt the morning tilt sideways beneath her feet. He was leaning against the brick wall beside the cart, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that fit him with the kind of precision that spoke of a very good tailor. Dark hair combed back, that same scar through his eyebrow catching the grey morning light. He looked, she thought with a small jolt of professional assessment, entirely recovered. No trace of the grey, bloodless man who had lain dying in her trauma bay less than 2 weeks ago, except for the very slight stiffness in the way he stood, favouring his left side. "Mr. Conti," she said, and heard, with some annoyance at herself, the way her voice caught faintly on his name. "Dr. Ricci." His mouth curved, not quite a smile, something more restrained and more devastating for its restraint. "Small city. New York has 8 million people. This is not a small city." And yet, he gestured faintly at the space between them, "here we are." She should have walked away, every instinct honed by 4 years of dealing with patients who developed inconvenient attachments to the people who had saved their lives, told her to smile politely, take her coffee, and go. Instead, she found herself saying, "You look better than the last time I saw you. I had an excellent surgeon. I believe I was your attending, not your surgeon. You stabilized me enough to survive until the surgeon got there. In my experience, that's the harder job." He said this simply, without flattery in his tone, and something about the flat, factual way he delivered it disarmed her more than any compliment could have. "I never got the chance to thank you properly. The flowers were thanks enough, and the donation, which I assume was also you, though you were careful enough to root it through a foundation I couldn't trace." Something flickered in his dark eyes, surprise maybe, or amusement, or both. "You investigated me. I'm a doctor, not an idiot. Anonymous donations that happen to coincide with a mysterious patient's discharge tend to raise a doctor's curiosity." She accepted her coffee from Hector, wrapping both hands around the cup for warmth against the October chill. "Who are you, Mr. Conti? Really?" For a moment, just a moment, something passed behind his eyes that looked almost like the truth trying to claw its way to the surface before he mastered it, the way she imagined he mastered everything, with total, practiced control. "A man who owes you a debt he intends to repay," he said. "Nothing more sinister than that." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you right now." He said it with such quiet, unapologetic honesty that she found she could not summon the anger the evasion probably deserved. "Have dinner with me." The bluntness of it startled a short laugh out of her. That's quite a leap from coffee cart small talk. "I'm not a subtle man, Dr. Ricci. I find subtlety wastes time, and I've recently been reminded that time is not something any of us are guaranteed." Something darkened behind his eyes, brief and real. "You saved my life. I would like the chance to know the woman who did it. over something better than hospital coffee and fluorescent lighting. I don't date patients. I'm no longer your patient. I was discharged 11 days ago. You're impossible. I'm told that often. That almost smile again, warmer this time, and Elena felt something in her chest loosen, despite every professional instinct screaming at her to walk away. One dinner, Dr. Ritchie. If you find me as impossible in person as you clearly already believe me to be, I promise not to trouble you again. She should have said no. She thought of the 8 months since her last date, of the careful, deliberate emptiness she had built into her personal life, because grief had taught her a long time ago that caring about people came with a bill she was not always able to pay. She thought of her father's voice, warm and worried, asking her every Sunday why a woman as remarkable as she was insisted on being so alone. "One dinner," she heard herself say, "and if you lie to me about your name again, it's the last one." Something shifted in his face. Not quite guilt, but close to it, close enough that she filed the observation away for later. "Friday night," he said. "I'll send a car. I can find my own way to a restaurant, Mr. Conti. Humour me." He straightened from the wall, wincing very slightly at the movement, a tell she doubted anyone else would have caught. "A woman who saved my life deserves to arrive somewhere nicer than a subway platform." He left before she could argue further, disappearing into a black car that had been idling at the curb the entire time, and Elena stood on the sidewalk with her coffee cooling in her hands, watching the space where he'd been, feeling the particular vertigo of a woman who had just, against every instinct she possessed, agreed to have dinner with a man she was almost entirely certain was not telling her the truth about who he was. "Girl," Hector said from behind the cart, grinning, "that man looked at you like you hung the moon." "That man," Elena said, "is going to be a problem." She was right. She had no idea yet how right. The restaurant Damien chose occupied the entire top floor of a converted warehouse in Tribeca, all exposed brick and candlelight, a single table set in the centre of an otherwise empty room, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the Hudson. "You rented out the whole restaurant," Elena said, standing in the doorway in a simple black dress she'd changed into 3 times before settling on, feeling suddenly uncomfortably underdressed for whatever this evening actually was. "I own the building," Damien said, rising from the table to pull out her chair, a gesture so old-fashioned and unhurried that it took her by surprise. "The restaurant's owner and I have an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" "The kind where he gets excellent rent, and I get privacy when I need it." He returned to his own seat, watching her with an attention so total it made her skin prickle. "You look beautiful, Dr. Ricci." "You look like a man who's used to getting whatever he wants." "I am." He said it without arrogance, simply as a fact, and something about the plainness of the admission made her laugh despite herself. "Does that frighten you?" "Should it?" "No." His eyes held hers, dark and steady. "Not from me. Never from me." The evening unfolded slower than she expected, and stranger too. Course after course of food she suspected cost more than her monthly rent, wine poured by a silent waiter who appeared and vanished like smoke, and conversation that circled again and again around the edges of who Marco Conti really was, without ever quite landing on an answer. "Tell me about your father," Damien said, somewhere between the second course and the third, his voice carefully casual in a way that made her look up sharply. "Why my father?" You mentioned him at the coffee cart, something about Sundays. He shrugged, the gesture too smooth to be entirely unrehearsed. I find myself curious about the people who made you who you are. Elena considered him for a long moment before answering, some instinct telling her this was not idle curiosity, though she couldn't have said why. He was a trauma surgeon, retired now. His hands aren't steady enough anymore, which he'll never admit to anyone but me. He ran a private clinic in Little Italy for almost 30 years. That's actually why I became a doctor. I used to sit in his waiting room after school and watch him save people who had nowhere else to go. Men who couldn't walk into a regular ER without questions being asked. Families who couldn't afford insurance. He never turned anyone away. Something moved behind Damien's eyes, quick and complicated, gone before she could name it. He sounds like an extraordinary man. He is. Her voice softened, the way it always did when she spoke of her father. He always told me that the measure of a doctor isn't the ones you save, it's whether you show up for the ones nobody else will. And you believe that? I've built my entire life around it. She turned her wine glass slowly by its stem, watching the candlelight refract through it. What about you? What did your father teach you? Damien was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. When he spoke, his voice had gone lower, rougher, carrying weight she hadn't heard from him before. My father taught me that a debt, once given, is sacred, that the men who forget what they owe are the same men who end up with nothing, because a world without gratitude is a world without loyalty, and a man without loyalty dies alone. He looked at her, something unbearably direct in his gaze. He also taught me that some debts can never truly be repaid, only honoured. That's a strange thing to teach a child. I did not have a usual childhood, Dr. Ricci. A faint, humourless smile. Neither, I suspect, did you, growing up in a waiting room full of men who couldn't go to a regular hospital. She should have asked him then, should have pressed, should have demanded to know what kind of family taught its children about sacred debts and men who died alone for forgetting them. Instead, she found herself watching his face in the candlelight, the hard planes of it softened by something that looked, in unguarded moments, almost like grief, and felt the strange, dangerous pull of wanting to know him rather than expose him. "You never told me your real name," she said instead, quietly. Damien's jaw tightened, just slightly, and for a moment she thought he might finally tell her the truth. Instead, he reached across the table and, with a gentleness that startled her more than any declaration could have, took her hand in both of his. "Not yet," he said. "But I promise you, Elena, when I do, I'll tell you everything. Every ugly, complicated piece of it. I only ask that when that day comes, you remember this dinner. Remember that whatever else I am, this," he gestured between them, "was never a lie." "That's not very reassuring, Marco." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. But it's the truth, and it's more than most men will ever offer you." Outside, the lights of Jersey City glittered across the black water, and Elena Ricci sat with her hand in the hands of a man whose real name she did not know, whose danger she could not yet fully measure, and felt something in her carefully guarded heart begin slowly, and against every warning bell her training had ever taught her to heed, to open. Red Hook, Brooklyn, 31 years earlier. The warehouse fire cast the whole waterfront in flickering orange, and 28-year-old Antonio Ricci was 3 blocks away in his clinic, stitching a laceration on a longshoreman's forearm, when the door burst open and 2 men carried a third between them, blood soaking through his shirt in a spreading black stain. "He's dying," one of them said, his voice cracking with panic. "Please, we can't take him to a hospital." Antonio Ricci had run a clinic in this neighbourhood long enough to know exactly what that sentence meant and exactly what it would cost him if he said yes. He looked at the man's face, pale, sweating, a bullet wound high in his chest that whistled faintly with every laboured breath, a sucking chest wound that would kill him within the hour without immediate intervention, and made the decision that would alter the next 30 years of 2 families' lives without either of them ever fully understanding why. "Table," he said, "now, and someone find me more light." He worked through the night, hands steady, despite the danger of what he was doing, sealing the wound, re-inflating the collapsed lung, transfusing blood from a cooler one of the men had, with horrifying foresight, brought along in case this exact scenario occurred. By dawn, Salvatore Marchetti, though Antonio would not learn his name until 3 days later, when the man was well enough to speak, was breathing on his own, weak but alive, in a back room above the clinic that Antonio's wife kept stocked with clean linens for exactly this purpose. "You saved my life," Salvatore said, once he could speak, his voice hoarse but his eyes sharp, missing nothing, assessing the young doctor who had just risked his own freedom and possibly his life to save a stranger. "You know who I am now. You know what I am. I know you were a man bleeding to death in my clinic," Antonio said simply. "That's all I needed to know." Salvatore studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind his hard eyes. "Most men in this city would have turned me away rather than risk what you risked tonight." "Most men in this city aren't doctors." "That's not an answer to what I asked you." Salvatore's voice hardened, though not unkindly. "Why did you save me, Dr. Ricci?" Antonio considered the question seriously, the way he considered every question, weighing it with the same care he'd give a diagnosis. "Because you needed saving," he said finally. "Because that's the only measure of a doctor that ever mattered to me. Not who deserves to live, just who's in front of me, needing help." Something in Salvatore Marchetti's face changed then, a hardness softening, if only slightly, if only for a moment, and he reached out with a hand, still weak from blood loss, and gripped Antonio's wrist. "I am not a good man, Dr. Ricci," he said. "I have done things in my life that would make you turn me away from your door if you knew them all. But I have never once forgotten a debt, and I owe you my life. From this night forward, you and your family have my protection, whether you want it or not. If ever you or yours need anything, anything at all, you send word, and it will be done." "I don't need protection from a man I just met." "You don't need it," Salvatore agreed, "but you have it. And someday, Dr. Ricci, I hope you never find out what that protection has spared you from. Because a man like me, once he decides your family is under his roof, will burn down the world before he lets harm come to you." Antonio Ricci did not fully understand that night the weight of what had just been placed on his shoulders. He would understand it slowly, over the following decades, in the mysterious way his clinic never once suffered a break-in a neighbourhood plagued by them. In the quiet, untraceable manner, his malpractice insurance premiums always seemed lower than they should have been. In the strange fact that his daughter, born 6 years later, grew up in a world that felt, in ways she would never consciously register, gently and invisibly guarded. He told Elena the story only twice in her life, once when she was 16 and asked him why he'd become a doctor, and once, years later, on a Sunday afternoon, not long after a mysterious man named Marco Conti had first taken his daughter to dinner, when something in her voice as she mentioned him made her father's careful, aging heart go suddenly, quietly still. "Papa," Elena said, sitting across from him at his small kitchen table in Bensonhurst, sunlight slanting through lace curtains that had not changed in 30 years. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer me this time. You always ask me things I can't answer, cara. 30 years ago, you told me once that you saved a man's life, a man who was connected to something dangerous. You never told me his name." Antonio Ricci set down his coffee cup very slowly, his weathered hands, still elegant despite their tremor, going still against the table. "Why are you asking me this now, Elena?" "Because I think I might have saved his son." The silence that followed stretched long enough that the kitchen clock's ticking became audible, and Elena watched something move across her father's face that she had never seen there before in 31 years of being his daughter. Not surprise, but recognition, deep and old and heavy with things unspoken. "Tell me his name," Antonio said quietly. "The man you saved." "He calls himself Marco Conti, but I don't think that's real." Her father closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with something that looked, impossibly, like tears. "His name," Antonio Ricci said, "is Damian Marchetti. And Elena, cara mia, I need you to listen to me very carefully, because what I am about to tell you will change everything you think you understand about your own life." "Salvatore Marchetti," Antonio said slowly, each word deliberate, "was the head of one of the largest criminal organizations in New York. 31 years ago, I saved his life in the back room of my clinic. Off the books, no hospital, no police. He told me that night that my family would carry his protection forever, whether I wanted it or not." Elena sat very still, her coffee cooling, forgotten, in front of her. "You never told me this. How does a father tell his child that her safety, her whole comfortable life, might have been quietly guarded by a Mafia don's gratitude? What good would that knowledge have done you, except to make you afraid of shadows that were never actually threatening you?" Antonio's voice was gentle but unflinching. "I made my choice that night to save a dying man. I never once regretted it. But I also never wanted his world to touch yours. And now his son is—" Elena stopped, the pieces slotting into place with a horror that felt like ice water down her spine. "Damian Marchetti. Papa, I sat across from a mob boss at dinner. I held his hand across a candle-lit table. I treated him. I had his blood on my hands, and I thought—" She stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen, one hand pressed to her mouth. God, I thought he was interesting. I thought there was something sad and complicated about him that I wanted to understand. There probably is, Antonio said quietly. Salvatore Marchetti was not a simple man either, Elena. Violence does not preclude complexity. It rarely does. That's not comforting. I'm not trying to comfort you. I'm trying to tell you the truth, which is more than either of us got 30 years ago. Antonio reached across the table, catching his daughter's hand as she passed, stilling her frantic movement with the same quiet authority he'd used to calm frightened patients for 40 years. Elena, look at me. Did he tell you who he was? No, he's been lying to me from the moment I met him. Has he? Antonio's eyes were sharp, missing nothing, the same eyes that had once looked at a dying stranger and decided to save him, regardless of the cost. Or has he simply not yet told you the truth? There's a difference, cara, and I suspect a man like Damien Marchetti, a man raised by Salvatore, who I promise you was many terrible things, but never once a liar about the things that mattered, knows that difference better than most.
Papa, he's dangerous.
Yes, Antonio agreed simply. He is almost certainly very dangerous. I would imagine that men have died because he ordered it, and I would imagine he sleeps at night regardless, because that is the nature of the world he was born into. He squeezed her hand. But I also imagine that if he has come looking for the woman who saved his life, knowing or suspecting that her family carries a 30-year-old debt his father swore never to forget, then he is not simply a dangerous man amusing himself with a doctor. He is a man honouring something sacred to his family, whether he understands that himself yet or not. Elena sank back into her chair, her mind reeling, replaying every moment of their dinner through this new, vertiginous lens. The way he'd asked about her father with such careful, deliberate interest. The darkness that had moved behind his eyes when he spoke of debts that could never be repaid, only honoured. The strange, unbearable gentleness of his hands around hers, as if he were holding something he was afraid of breaking. He knew, she said slowly. He knew who I was before I ever knew who he was. He must have found out somehow after I treated him. That's why the flowers, the donation, the dinner. It was never a coincidence. No, Antonio agreed. I doubt very much that it was. Then what is it? Guilt? Obligation? Her voice cracked slightly. Am I just a debt he's trying to settle, Papa? Antonio was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter's face with the particular tenderness of a father who had watched her build careful walls around her heart for years, ever since a loss neither of them spoke of often, and who recognized, perhaps before she did herself, the shape of what was happening to her now. I cannot answer that for you, Elena, he said finally. I only knew Salvatore Marchetti for a handful of hours, 30 years ago, and I have not seen his son since he was a boy of 10, standing in my clinic doorway while his father thanked me with tears in his eyes. I do not know Damien's heart. He paused. But I know yours, and I have never once, in 31 years, seen you speak about a man the way you are speaking about this one, not even in anger, not even in fear. There is something else in your voice, cara, and I think you know exactly what it is, even if you are not ready to say it out loud. Elena said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be, in some fundamental way, a confession. Outside, the October afternoon had gone grey and quiet, the lace curtains stirring faintly in a draught from the old window frame. And Elena Ricci sat in her father's kitchen, with 30 years of hidden history unspooling around her, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than any danger Damien Marchetti's world could pose, that it was already far, far too late to walk away untouched. She did not call him. She told herself this was strength, was wisdom, was the only sane response to discovering that the man she'd let hold her hand across a candlelit table commanded an empire built on violence. He called her, instead, 4 days after her conversation with her father, his voice low and careful over the phone, in a way that told her he already suspected something had shifted. "Elena, you've been avoiding me." "I've been thinking." A pause, weighted with something that might have been fear in a lesser man. "About what?" "About who you really are, Marco. Or should I say, Damien?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that she thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed entirely, stripped of pretense, low and rough with something that sounded almost like relief. "How long have you known?" 4 days. My father told me." She closed her eyes, gripping the phone tighter. 30 years ago he saved your father's life. "He never told me any of it until I mentioned your name." "I know," Damien said quietly. "I found out the same way, the day after you saved mine. I recognized your name from a story my father told me twice in my life." A breath, ragged at the edges. "I should have told you myself. I wanted to. I was waiting for the right moment, and I kept telling myself there would be time." "You lied to me." "I omitted a truth I was afraid would end things before they'd even begun." His voice hardened slightly, though not with anger, with something that sounded disturbingly like desperation held carefully in check. "Elena, come to Aurelia tonight, my club in the meatpacking district. Let me explain everything, in person, the way I should have from the start." She should have said no. Every rational part of her, the doctor, the daughter, the woman who had spent 8 months deliberately alone because grief had taught her the cost of caring too much, screamed at her to end the call and never answer another one. "Fine," she said instead, "tonight. But Damien, this is your last chance to tell me the truth." Aurelia occupied a converted meat-packing warehouse, its exterior unmarked except for a single brass plaque, its interior a cavern of dark velvet and low golden light, a crowd of the city's wealthy and dangerous moving through it like fish in a lit aquarium. Elena felt eyes on her the moment she walked in, assessing, calculating, the particular attention of people accustomed to knowing exactly who belonged in a room and who did not. Damien found her before she'd made it halfway to the bar, materializing at her side with the same silent precision she remembered from the hospital. Dressed now in black that made him look less like a recovering patient and more like exactly what he was. A man who owned the room he stood in, and everyone breathing inside it. "You came," he said, something raw in his voice. "I said I would." He led her to a private booth, elevated slightly above the main floor, positioned, she noticed, with a clear line of sight to every entrance. The seating choice of a man who never stopped calculating threat, even in his own club. He ordered wine without asking what she wanted, and when she raised an eyebrow, he said simply, "I know what you drank at dinner. I pay attention." "That's not entirely reassuring, given what I now know about you." No, he agreed. I imagine very little about me is reassuring anymore. He turned his glass slowly on the table, not drinking. Ask me anything, Elena. I'll answer honestly, whatever it costs me. Are you a murderer? The bluntness of the question didn't make him flinch, though something tightened at the corner of his jaw. I have ordered deaths, he said quietly. I have killed men myself, when the situation demanded it. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise, or by dressing it up in euphemism. I inherited an empire built on violence, and I have spent 15 years since my father's death making sure that empire survives, which sometimes requires violence in return.
And you expect me to sit across from you and feel anything but fear?
I don't expect anything from you. His eyes held hers, dark and unflinching. I only know that the night you saved my life, something in me recognized something in you. Before I ever knew your name, before I knew anything about the debt our families share. I have told myself since that this was gratitude. I have told myself it was fate, or coincidence, or my father's ghost pulling strings from beyond the grave. But it is none of those things, Elena. It is simply that I have not felt anything resembling hope in 15 years, and the first time I opened my eyes in that hospital bed and saw your face, hope was exactly what I felt. Before she could answer, a man in an expensive suit slid into the booth uninvited, smiling with the particular oiliness of someone who did not fear consequences, his eyes travelling over Elena with open, proprietary interest. Damien, you've been holding out on us. He extended a hand toward Elena that she did not take. Anthony Castellana. And you are? The temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Damien did not move, did not raise his voice, but something in his stillness became suddenly terribly absolute, the air around him gone taut as a drawn wire. Get up, Damien said, very quietly, and walk away from this table, Anthony. Now. Just being friendly, Damien. No need for... I will not ask you twice. Something in his tone made even Anthony Castellano's confidence falter. He rose, hands raised in mock surrender, though his eyes lingered on Elena a moment longer than was safe for him. Didn't realize the lady was spoken for. My mistake. He melted back into the crowd, and Damien exhaled slowly, a muscle working in his jaw, his hand, she noticed only now, curled into a fist so tight his knuckles had gone white against the table. Who was that? Elena asked quietly. A Castellano, Damien said. The family that put 2 bullets in me 3 weeks ago. His eyes met hers, dark with something that looked almost like fear. The first fear she had seen in him since she'd first pulled him back from death. And now, Elena, that he's seen you sitting at my table, he knows exactly who to look at if he ever wants to hurt me again. The words settled over the table like a shroud. Elena felt the warmth of the club recede, replaced by a cold clarity she recognized from 1,000 trauma bays. The moment danger stopped being abstract and became instead a fact requiring immediate action. Are you saying I'm in danger because I had dinner with you? I'm saying, Damien said carefully, that the Castellanos have spent 3 weeks trying to determine who treated me the night they tried to kill me. If they connect the dots, and men like Anthony Castellano are not stupid, whatever else they are, they will understand that you are not simply a woman I'm courting. You are the doctor who saved the life they tried to end. Then why did you bring me here? Why not keep me away from all of this? Something moved across his face. Guilt, she thought, real and unguarded for the first time since she'd met him. Because I am a selfish man, Elena, and I wanted one night to know you, honestly, without the lie of a false name between us, before I did the responsible thing and disappeared from your life to keep you safe. That's not your decision to make alone. No, he agreed, it isn't, but it's mine to make regardless, because I have spent my entire adult life watching people I care about get hurt for the crime of being close to me, and I will not add you to that list if I can help it. You don't get to decide that for me, Damien. Her voice was fierce now, the fear transmuting into something closer to anger. I have spent my whole career choosing to run toward danger instead of away from it. I don't need you to protect me by disappearing. I need you to be honest with me and let me decide what risks I'm willing to take. He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped, rough and low, carrying a weight that made her breath catch. Do you have any idea, he said quietly, what it does to a man like me to sit across from a woman who looks at everything I am, the violence, the danger, all of it, and instead of running, argues with me about her right to stay? I'm not staying because I'm reckless. I'm staying because... She stopped, the sentence catching in her throat, unfinished and dangerous. Say it, Damien said, low, urgent. Whatever it is, say it, because I don't want to be anywhere else, Eleanor said finally, the words spilling out before she could stop them. God help me, Damien. I don't want to be anywhere else, and I don't fully understand why, given everything I now know about you. Something broke open in his expression then, relief and hunger, and a kind of desperate tenderness that looked almost like pain, and he reached across the table, his hand cupping her jaw with a gentleness that contradicted everything she now knew about the violence he was capable of. I have wanted to kiss you, he said, voice rough, since the moment you looked at me in that hospital bed and saw straight through my lie. I have told myself for 3 weeks that I have no right to want anything from you, given what I am, given what loving me would cost you. I am telling myself that right now, in fact, and finding that I no longer care. Then don't, Elena said softly. Don't tell yourself anything, just... He kissed her before she finished the sentence, and it was nothing like she expected from a man who ran an empire on fear and violence. It was slow and searching and careful, his hand cradling her jaw as if she were something infinitely breakable, something he had waited his whole life to be permitted to touch. She felt herself lean into it, felt the careful architecture of her professional distance crumble entirely, felt something in her chest that had been closed tight for years crack open like a fault line, finally giving way. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing unevenly in the golden dark of the club, the noise of the crowd suddenly very far away. This is going to be dangerous, he said quietly, for both of us. I need you to understand that before this goes any further. I'm a trauma doctor, Damien. Dangerous is the only kind of life I've ever known how to live. That's not the same thing as this. No, she agreed, pulling back just far enough to look him in the eyes. But I think I want to find out what it is, anyway. Across the room, unseen by either of them, Anthony Castellano watched from the bar with narrowed eyes, already reaching for his phone, already composing the message that would set in motion everything that followed. A single photograph of Damien Marchetti with his hand on a woman's face, sent to a number that would ensure within 24 hours that Salvatore Castellano's son knew exactly who to target if he wanted to bring the great Damien Marchetti to his knees. Salvatore Castellano was 71 years old, and he had spent the last 40 of those years hating the Marchetti name with the patient, cultivated intensity of a man who had never once forgotten a slight. "A doctor," he said, studying the photograph his son had sent, sitting in the wood-panelled study of his Staten Island estate, a fire crackling despite the mild October evening. Salvatore liked fire, liked the way it made a room feel like something out of the old country, like the Sicily his own father had fled decades before he was born. "Marchetti's got himself a doctor." "Not just any doctor, Papa." Anthony leaned forward, eager in the particular way of a son trying to impress a father who rarely offered praise. "I did some digging. She's the one who treated him the night of the hit. She's the reason he's still breathing." Something shifted behind Salvatore's rheumy eyes, the slow, satisfied calculation of a predator who has just located the exact spot to sink his teeth. "Then she matters to him." "More than that, Papa. I saw them together at Aurelia. The way he looked at her." Anthony shook his head. "I've never seen Damien Marchetti look at anything like that. Not a woman, not money, not power. He looked at her like she was the only thing in the room worth protecting." Salvatore rose slowly from his chair, moving to the fire, his hands clasped behind his back in the manner of a man accustomed to being obeyed without needing to raise his voice. "Damien Marchetti has been a thorn in this family's side for 15 years. His father built an empire on the bones of families this family should have owned, and I have waited a very long time for a weakness worth exploiting." He turned, firelight catching the hard lines of his face. "Find out everything about this doctor, where she lives, where she works, who she loves, who she owes. And Anthony, find out gently. I don't want Damien to know we're looking until it's far, far too late for him to do anything about it. You want to take her? I want to understand exactly how much she's worth to him first." Salvatore's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. A man who has never once shown weakness in 15 years of running that family has finally shown me his throat. I intend to take my time deciding exactly how to use it. 3 days later, Frank Delgado brought Damien news that made his blood run cold, in a way 3 decades of violence had never quite managed. "They're asking questions at Mercy General," Delgado said, standing in Damien's penthouse office, his usually unflappable composure visibly strained. "Careful questions, routed through people who don't know they're working for Castellano, but questions all the same. Who was the doctor on duty the night of the shooting on Mulberry Street? Where does she live? What's her schedule?" Damien felt something cold and absolute settle over him. Not panic, he did not permit himself panic, but a clarity so total it felt like ice water in his veins. How much do they know? Enough. They know her name. They know where she works. I'd assume within days they'll know where she lives, what car she doesn't own, what subway line she takes every Sunday to see her father. Delgado's jaw was tight. "Damien, I warned you this would happen the moment you brought her into your world." "I know what you warned me." Damien's voice was low, controlled, the particular stillness of a man holding back something enormous by sheer force of will. Double the surveillance on her. I want eyes on Elena Ricci every hour of every day. Invisible to her if possible, but I want to know if a Castellano so much as looks at her sideways. And if she notices, then I will tell her the truth, and she can decide for herself whether she wants that protection.
Damien moved to the window, staring out at the city he had spent 15 years learning to control, feeling for the first time in longer than he could remember the particular terror of having something to lose that mattered more than his own life. Vincent, call a meeting with the capos. If Salvatore Castellano thinks he's found a way to bring me to my knees, I want him to understand, in terms he cannot mistake, exactly what will happen to his family if he touches a single hair on her head. That's a declaration of war, Damien. The war started the night they put 2 bullets in me at La Notte. Damien's reflection in the glass looked back at him, hard and cold, and utterly unlike the man who had held Elena's face in his hands 3 nights ago at Aurelia. I am simply choosing now to fight it on my own terms before they choose to fight it on hers. Outside the window, the city glittered on, indifferent to the war quietly gathering beneath its surface. And somewhere across that same skyline, in an apartment in Murray Hill, Elena Ricci slept soundly, unaware that her name had just become the single most valuable and most dangerous currency in a conflict between 2 families that had been circling each other for 30 years. For 6 days, Damien did not call her. Eleanor told herself this was fine. She told herself this while lying awake at 3 a.m., replaying the kiss at Aurelia, the rough tenderness of his voice, the way he'd looked at her like she was something he'd been starving for his entire adult life. And then 6 days of nothing. No calls, no flowers. No black car waiting at the curb. She told herself it was fine, and she was lying, and she knew she was lying, and she called him anyway on the 7th day, her professional pride finally cracking under the weight of a silence she couldn't explain. He didn't answer. She called twice more over the following 2 days, leaving no messages, her stomach twisting tighter each time the call went to voicemail without so much as a ring. Maybe he changed his mind, she said to her friend Priya over lunch in the hospital cafeteria, pushing a sad tray of cafeteria pasta around her plate. Maybe finding out I knew who he really was scared him off. Or maybe, Priya said, with the particular bluntness of a friend who had heard every version of this story for years, the mysterious rich man with the fake name and the anonymous $40,000 donation is exactly as complicated as he seemed, and you should probably stop waiting by the phone for him. Elena knew Priya was right, in the general sense that a woman should never wait by a phone for any man. She did not know, could not have known, that 4 floors below her own apartment building, in an unmarked car, one of Damien's men sat in 12-hour rotating shifts, watching her building around the clock, and that Damien himself had spent the last week in a state of controlled, grinding fury, directing an increasingly brutal campaign of intimidation against every Castellano asset he could identify, precisely because he had decided that the only way to keep her safe was to end the threat before it ever reached her, and that doing so meant staying away from her entirely, so that nothing connecting them could be used against either of them while the war was still being fought in shadows. He watched her, some nights, from that same black car, unable to stop himself, though he never once approached. He watched her leave the hospital, exhausted after double shifts, watched her run along the East River at dawn, watched her visit her father every Sunday, and told himself each time that this distance was a mercy, a protection, the only gift he had left to offer a woman who deserved so much better than the war he was bringing to her doorstep. It was Vincent who finally confronted him, 11 days into the silence, finding Damien in his penthouse at 2 a.m., staring at a phone he had not used to call the one person he actually wanted to hear from. "You're punishing yourself," Vincent said, without preamble, pouring himself a whiskey he did not ask permission for. "And her, though I doubt you've considered that part of it." "I'm protecting her." "By disappearing without explanation? By letting her think you simply lost interest?" Vincent's voice was uncharacteristically sharp. "Damien, I have known you since you were 19 years old, watching your father run this family with an iron fist and a broken heart he never let anyone see. I watched you become exactly that same man, closed off, controlled, convinced that loving anything openly is a liability you cannot afford. And I am telling you now, as your friend and not your consigliere, that you are about to make your father's exact mistake." "What mistake is that?" "Your father loved your mother desperately, and he protected that love by hiding it so completely that she spent the last 10 years of her marriage believing he'd stopped caring." Vincent's eyes were hard, unflinching. "She died believing that, Damien. Your father told me himself, the week before he died, that it was the single greatest regret of his entire life. Not the men he'd killed, not the empire he'd built on blood, but the woman he loved and never let himself show it to, because he was so convinced that distance was the same thing as protection." Damien said nothing, his jaw tight, the whiskey in his own glass untouched. "Elena Ricci is not a woman who needs you to disappear to keep her safe," Vincent continued, quieter now. "She's a trauma doctor, Damien. She runs toward gunshot wounds for a living. What she needs is honesty. She needs to know what's happening, what the danger actually is, and the choice to decide for herself whether she wants to face it beside you or walk away from it entirely. What you're doing right now isn't protection. It's cowardice, dressed up as sacrifice, and I think, somewhere underneath all that careful control, you know it." Damien was quiet for a long time after Vincent left, sitting alone in the dark of his penthouse, the city lights spread out below him like a field of dying stars. And when he finally picked up his phone, his hands were not entirely steady. "I owe you an explanation," he typed, "and an apology. Can I see you tomorrow?" The reply came faster than he expected, 3 words that hit him harder than any bullet ever had. "Yes, please come." He came to her apartment the next evening, standing in her doorway, looking, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely uncertain. A man accustomed to absolute control, visibly unsettled by the prospect of an apology he did not know how to phrase. "You disappeared," Elena said, standing back to let him in, her voice carefully neutral, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she was certain he could hear it. 11 days, Damien. No call, no explanation. I thought—" "I know what you thought." His voice was rough. "I'm sorry. I should have told you what was happening instead of leaving you to wonder." "Then tell me now." He told her everything, standing in her small living room with its mismatched furniture and its shelves crowded with medical textbooks, his voice low and measured, even as the content of what he described grew darker with every sentence.
The Castellanos' investigation into her identity, the growing threat against her safety, the war he had been quietly waging in the shadows to neutralize that threat before it could reach her, and the decision, made in what he now recognized as fear disguised as nobility, to disappear rather than burden her with the full weight of the danger she was in. "You made that decision without me," Elena said when he finished, her voice tight with a fury she hadn't expected to feel.
"You decided, all on your own, that the way to protect me was to make me feel like I'd imagined everything between us." "I know, I was wrong." He crossed the room, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, could see the raw, unguarded exhaustion in his face. "Vincent told me I was making my father's mistake. He loved my mother his entire life and never let her see it clearly enough, and she died believing he'd stopped caring. I would rather burn my entire empire to the ground than let that happen to you. Then don't disappear again. Ever." Her voice cracked slightly. "Damien, I have spent my whole career learning to sit with uncertainty, with not knowing if a patient will survive the night. I can handle danger. What I cannot handle is being shut out of decisions about my own life by a man who's decided unilaterally that silence is a form of love. It won't happen again." He reached for her hands, holding them with a care that contradicted every violent thing she now knew about him. "I need you to understand exactly what you're choosing, though, before you choose it. The Castellanos know about you. They know you saved my life. If this war escalates the way I fear it will, you become a target whether you're standing beside me or 1,000 miles away, simply because of what you represent to them. The one thing in this world I would burn everything down to protect. Then let me help you protect myself." Her chin lifted, dark eyes steady despite the fear she couldn't fully hide. "I'm not asking you to keep me in a tower, Damien. I'm asking you to trust me with the truth, the way I trusted you enough to save your life without knowing your name." Something in his face broke open then, raw and unguarded, in a way she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to see. "My father used to say that the measure of a man isn't the empire he builds, it's whether he's brave enough to be truly known by the people he loves." His thumb traced slow circles over the back of her hand. "I have not been truly known by anyone in 15 years, Eleanor. Not since my father died, and I inherited a world that taught me love was a weakness to be exploited by my enemies." "And now?" "And now," he said, voice rough with something that sounded almost like wonder, "I find that I would rather be known by you, fully, dangerously, than continue living safely unknown by everyone." He lifted her hand, pressing his lips to her knuckles with a reverence that made her breath catch. "I love you, Elena. I did not intend to. I told myself for weeks that this was gratitude, obsession, my father's ghost pulling strings, but it is none of those things. It is simply that you are the first person in 15 years who has looked at everything I am and chosen to stay anyway. And I do not know how to be the man I was before you. Not anymore." Elena stood very still, the words settling over her like a slow, warm tide, and felt her own carefully guarded heart finally, fully give way. "I love you too," she said quietly. "God help me, Damien. I think I have, since the moment you asked me my name in that hospital bed, and I felt something crack open that I'd kept locked for years." He kissed her then, slow and deep and searching, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other pressed flat against her lower back, pulling her against him, like a man, finally, after 15 years of careful, deliberate distance, allowing himself to be held. She felt herself melt into it, into him, every rational warning bell drowned beneath the simple, overwhelming truth of wanting him, danger and all, more than she had ever wanted the safety of her carefully built solitude. Neither of them noticed the black sedan idling across the street, its occupant photographing the lit window of her apartment with a long lens, already composing the message that would reach Salvatore Castellano within the hour. Confirmed. She's the one. He's in love with her. Salvatore Castellano received the photograph over dinner, studying it for a long moment before setting his fork down with the deliberate calm of a man who had waited a very long time for exactly this opportunity. "Anthony," he said, "call the Reyes crew. Tell them I have a job worth a great deal of money, and it needs to happen fast. Papa, if we move against her directly, Damien will know it was us instantly. There's no ambiguity there. It's a declaration." "Good." Salvatore's smile was thin and cold. "I want him to know exactly who has her, and exactly what it will cost him to get her back. A man like Damien Marchetti does not respond to threats against his territory, his money, his soldiers. He has weathered all of that for 15 years without blinking. But a man who loves a woman the way he loves this doctor..." Salvatore's eyes glittered in the candlelight. "That man will burn his own empire down and hand me the ashes if it means getting her back safely." "And if he doesn't negotiate? If he simply comes for her with everything he has?" "Then we will have drawn him out of his fortress and into open ground, where 30 years of careful positioning finally pays off." Salvatore lifted his wineglass, studying the deep red of it in the firelight. "Either way, Anthony, we win. That is the beauty of a well-laid trap. It does not matter which direction the prey runs. Every path leads back to us." Elena worked a double shift on Thursday, the kind of grueling 16 hours that left her running on adrenaline and stale coffee, and by the time she left Mercy General at 11 p.m., exhausted in the particular way that made every streetlight look slightly too bright. She noticed nothing wrong with the parking garage until the moment a hand closed hard over her mouth from behind. She fought, every instinct trained by years of self-defense classes her father had insisted on since she was a teenager, screaming through her exhausted body, driving her elbow back into her attacker's ribs, twisting hard against the grip on her arm. But there were 2 of them, then 3, and the world tilted sideways as something sharp pricked her neck, and a cold, spreading numbness began climbing up from the injection site with horrifying speed. "Easy, Doctor," a voice said, close to her ear, almost gentle. "This doesn't have to hurt if you don't fight it." Her last clear thought, before the darkness swallowed her whole, was of Damien's face in candlelight, and a terror that had nothing to do with her own life, and everything to do with what this would cost him. Damien's phone rang at 11:47 p.m., and he knew, from the particular tightness in Vincent's voice, before his consigliere had even finished the first sentence, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. She left the hospital at 11. Our surveillance lost visual contact with her in the parking garage for exactly 4 minutes before she should have reached her car. Vincent's voice was clipped,
controlled, the voice of a man forcing himself not to panic in front of his boss. "Damien, she never made it to her car." There's a security camera blackout in the garage, exactly 4 minutes, timed too perfectly to be a coincidence. Our man on the ground found her purse and one shoe near the stairwell exit. The silence that followed was absolute, and in it, Damien Marchetti felt something in himself break apart entirely. 15 years of careful, disciplined control shattering like glass under a hammer blow. "Get me everyone," he said, and his voice had gone somewhere Vincent had not heard it go in 15 years of friendship. Flat, cold, utterly without mercy. "Every soldier we have, every gun, every favour owed to this family in the last 30 years called in tonight." "Damien, they took her, Vincent." His hand closed around the phone, hard enough to crack the casing. "Salvatore Castellano has taken the only thing in this world I have ever truly loved, and I am going to burn his entire family to the ground to get her back. And there is nothing that is going to stop me." Outside his penthouse windows, the city glittered on, indifferent and beautiful, utterly unaware that within its skyline a war 30 years in the making had just, in a single stolen moment in a parking garage, become inevitable. Eleanor woke slowly, her mouth dry, her thoughts sluggish with whatever drug they'd used, the throb of the headache pulsing behind her eyes in time with her heartbeat. She was sitting upright in a hard wooden chair, wrists bound behind her back, with something that bit into her skin, in a room that smelled of damp concrete and motor oil. A warehouse, she realized slowly, or some kind of storage facility, industrial and cold. "Ah," said a voice from the shadows, warm and cultured, in a way that made her skin crawl. "She's awake." Salvatore Castellano stepped into the single pool of light hanging from the ceiling, an old man with sharp, calculating eyes, and the kind of stillness that spoke of decades spent being obeyed without question. He crouched slightly, studying her face with clinical interest. "Dr. Elena Ricci," he said. "Do you know who I am?" "I have a guess." Her voice came out steadier than she expected, 4 years of trauma medicine having trained her, at least, to keep her composure under duress. "You're the man who tried to kill Damien 3 weeks ago." "I'm the man who is going to succeed this time," Salvatore said mildly, "with your help, whether you offer it willingly or not." He straightened, moving to a small table where a phone sat waiting. "You are going to make a call for me, Doctor. A very simple call. You are going to tell Damien Marchetti that you are frightened, that you want him to come for you alone, unarmed, and that if he does not arrive within the hour, I will begin sending him pieces of you to encourage his cooperation. He won't fall for that. He already has fallen for it, Doctor. That is precisely the problem with loving someone the way he loves you." Salvatore's smile was thin and terrible. A smart man protects himself by never allowing anyone to matter enough to be used against him. Damien Marchetti made the mistake of caring, and now he is going to walk into my hands like a lamb to slaughter, because the alternative, losing you, is a grief he has decided he cannot survive. Elena said nothing, her mind racing, cataloguing every detail of the room with the same clinical precision she brought to a trauma bay. 2 exits, one guarded, the other, apparently unwatched, behind a stack of shipping crates.
3 visible men besides Salvatore himself. A rusted pipe within reach of her bound hands, if she could only work the ropes loose enough to reach it. She did not know that even now, 40 minutes away, Damien Marchetti was moving through the city with a small army at his back, having called in 30 years of debts and alliances in a single furious night, tracing a phone signal from a burner cell one of Salvatore's men had foolishly used to text confirmation of the kidnapping to an associate. A single mistake that Frank Delgado's team had caught within the hour, giving Damien a location before Salvatore had even finished his opening speech to his captive. "You're wrong about one thing," Elena said quietly, buying time, watching the ropes at her wrists with careful, hidden attention as she worked them slowly against the chair's rough wood. "You said a smart man protects himself by never letting anyone matter. But you're not describing weakness, Mr. Castellano. You're describing exactly the thing that makes him dangerous. A man with nothing to lose is predictable. A man fighting for something he loves more than his own life. That man doesn't follow anyone's rules but his own." Something flickered in Salvatore's eyes, the first crack of uncertainty she'd seen in him, before he masked it with a cold laugh. "Bold words for a woman tied to a chair." "I'm a trauma doctor," Elena said. "I've spent my entire career staying calm while people bleed out in front of me. Being tied to a chair by an old man with a grudge doesn't scare me nearly as much as you'd like it to." Salvatore's hand cracked across her face before she finished the sentence, sharp and sudden, snapping her head sideways, and for a moment the room swam with white, static pain. When her vision cleared, she found him crouched in front of her again, his expression gone flat and dangerous. "You will learn respect, Doctor, one way or another," he said quietly. "And when Damien arrives to find you broken and afraid, he will understand, finally, the price of loving something in this world. That is a lesson 30 years overdue, and I intend to teach it thoroughly." Elena said nothing, tasting copper at the corner of her mouth, and kept working the ropes at her wrists, one slow, patient inch at a time, while somewhere in the dark beyond the warehouse walls, sirens of a different kind were already closing in. The warehouse Salvatore had chosen sat, with the symbolism he had clearly intended, and Damien recognized instantly with a fresh wave of fury, 3 blocks from the exact spot where Salvatore's own father had once ambushed Damien's father 31 years before. "He wants this to feel like justice," Damien said quietly, standing in the shadow of a shipping container 200 yards from the warehouse, watching thermal imaging on a tablet Delgado held between them, counting heat signatures moving inside. "He's bringing this full circle. Red Hook again, 30 years later." 6 men inside, including Salvatore himself, Delgado said. 2 more on the perimeter that we've already neutralized quietly. She's alive, Damien. The thermal shows her sitting upright, moving periodically. She's fighting. Something in Damien's chest, coiled tight with fear for the last 3 hours, loosened fractionally at the confirmation. "I go in first. Alone." "Damien, that's insane. Let the men clear the... If I send an army through that door, the first thing that happens is a bullet in her before we clear the room," Damien said, his voice absolutely flat, absolutely certain. "Salvatore wants to see me come for her personally. Fine. I'll give him exactly that.
But the moment I'm inside and he's focused on me, your men move on every exit, and if a single shot is fired at her, I want this whole building turned to rubble with everyone in it." Vincent, standing at his other shoulder, said nothing, but the look he gave Damien carried 30 years of friendship and the silent, terrible understanding that his boss was about to walk unarmed into a room with the man who wanted him dead more than anyone else alive.
"Give me 20 minutes, Damien said. "If I'm not out with her by then, burn it down."
He walked into the warehouse alone, hands visible, jacket open to show he carried no weapon, and found Salvatore Castellano waiting exactly where he expected, standing beside a wooden chair where Eleanor sat bound, a bruise darkening along her cheekbone that made something in Damien's chest ignite with a rage so total it felt, for one dangerous moment, like it might consume him entirely. He did not let it show. 15 years of discipline held, even now, even with the woman he loved bleeding in front of him. "Damien," Salvatore said, smiling with genuine warmth, the smile of a man who had waited 30 years for this exact moment. "You came. Alone, unarmed, exactly as I asked. How touching."
"Let her go, Salvatore. This is between us. It has been between us for 30 years, long before either of us was born, if we're being honest about what our fathers started." "Your father should have died in that warehouse 31 years ago." Salvatore's voice had lost its warmth entirely now, cold and old and full of hatred that had clearly festered, untreated for decades. Instead, a doctor with more courage than sense saved him, and your family has grown fat and powerful ever since on territory that should have belonged to mine. I have waited 30 years for a way to finally settle that debt, Damien. And here it is, sitting bound in a chair offered to me by the same bloodline that stole my family's future once already. "You want to kill me," Damien said quietly. "Fine. Kill me. But let her walk out of here first. She has nothing to do with what happened between our fathers." "She has everything to do with it," Salvatore snapped, some of his composure finally cracking. "Her father saved yours. She saved you. This family has been a thorn in mine for 30 years because of a debt of gratitude, and I intend to end that cycle tonight, permanently, by taking from you exactly what your family took from mine. A future." Elena, watching this exchange with wide, alert eyes, finally spoke, her voice hoarse but steady. "He's wrong, Damien. My father didn't save yours to steal anything from the Castellanos. He saved a dying man because that's what doctors do. There was never a war to be started over that. Salvatore built one out of 30 years of bitterness that had nothing to do with anyone but himself." Salvatore's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, and Damien moved at the exact same moment, not toward Salvatore, but sideways, positioning his own body between the old man and Elena's chair with the pure, unthinking speed of a man who had spent his entire life training for exactly this moment. "You want to shoot someone tonight, old man?" Damien said, low and dangerous. "You'll have to go through me. And I promise you, whatever happens after that, my men outside will make sure you never leave this building alive." The standoff stretched
taut and terrible, Salvatore's finger trembling on the trigger of a gun, now aimed directly at Damien's chest. 30 years of hatred and grief and stolen ambition boiling behind his eyes. And then, from somewhere behind them, Vincent's voice cut through the silence, calm and absolute.
20 minutes are up, Salvatore. Look outside. Salvatore's men, watching through the warehouse's grimy windows, went suddenly visibly pale. The building was surrounded, red laser sights dancing across the concrete floor from a dozen different angles. Damien's small army having moved into position with silent, ruthless efficiency during the standoff. "You're finished," Damien said quietly. "The only question left is whether you die here tonight, or whether you put the gun down and we discuss what happens next. Like two men who understand, finally, that this war has already cost both our families more than either can afford to keep paying." Salvatore's hand shook, the gun wavering between Damien's chest and some middle distance that suggested, for the first time all night, genuine doubt.
"You'd let me walk away," he said slowly, "after everything I've done tonight."
"I didn't say that." Damien's voice was hard, cold, utterly without warmth. "I said you have a choice about how the next 5 minutes go. Put the gun down, and we discuss terms. Keep pointing it at me, and my men turn this building into a grave the moment I give the word." For a long, terrible moment, nothing moved. Elena, still bound to the chair, watched Damien's face. The absolute stillness of it, the total control, betrayed only by the faint, telltale tremor in the hand he kept carefully at his side, out of Salvatore's line of sight. A tremor she recognized instantly as fear, carefully mastered, but never fully banished. Then Salvatore's shoulders sagged, decades of hatred finally, visibly draining out of him all at once, and the gun lowered.
"My father spent his whole life telling me the Marchettis stole our future," he said quietly, his voice suddenly old and tired, in a way it hadn't been moments before. "I have spent my whole life believing him. Perhaps it is only now, an old man with a gun pointed at another man's chest, that I understand how much of my life I have wasted on a grief that was never really mine to carry." "Put the gun down, Salvatore," Damien said, quieter now, some of the hardness leaving his own voice. "End this tonight, not with more blood, with peace, finally, 30 years too late, but not too late to matter." Salvatore set the gun on the table beside him, his hands shaking now with something closer to grief than fear, and sank into a chair of his own, an old man suddenly looking every one of his 71 years. "Untie her," Damien said, and one of Salvatore's remaining men, glancing nervously at his boss for permission that came in the form of a small, defeated nod, moved to cut the ropes at Elena's wrists. The moment she was free, Damien crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms with a desperation he made no attempt to hide, his hands moving over her carefully, checking for injuries with the frantic, thorough attention of a man who had spent the last 4 hours believing he might never hold her again. "I'm all right," Elena murmured against his chest, her own arms wrapping tight around him, relief and adrenaline finally catching up with her all at once. "Damien, I'm all right. You came." "I would burn the entire world down for you,"
he said roughly, his voice cracking on the words, pulling back just far enough to press his forehead against hers, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that contradicted every ounce of violence the night had contained. Every single time, Elena, every single time, I would come for you. Behind them, Vincent moved efficiently through the warehouse, his men securing Salvatore's remaining soldiers, disarming rather than executing, a mercy that Damien had ordered before ever setting foot in the building, not out of weakness, but out of a clarity that had crystallized in him over the last several hours, that a peace built on total annihilation was no peace at all, only the seed of the next 30-year war.
Salvatore, Damien said, turning back toward the old man, who sat slumped and defeated in his chair, watching his own men disarmed around him, with the particular grief of a man who had gambled everything on one final throw of the dice and lost. This ends tonight, not with your death, not with more blood between our families. You will withdraw from every territory dispute you've raised in the last 5 years. You will make no further move against my family, my businesses, or anyone connected to me, ever again. In exchange, I will let you keep your life, your remaining assets, and whatever peace an old man can find after wasting 30 years on a war that should have ended before it began. And if I refuse? Then I burn everything you have left to the ground, starting tonight, and I promise you, old man, there will be no one left standing in your family by morning to mourn you. Damien's voice was absolutely level, absolutely without mercy, though his hand, still resting protectively at the small of Elena's back, remained gentle, even as his voice hardened. But I would rather end this the way it should have ended 30 years ago, with two families finally putting down the debts of hatred neither of us actually chose to carry. Your call, Salvatore, but you have exactly one chance to make it. Salvatore looked at Damien for a long moment, then at Elena, standing beside him, with her chin lifted despite the bruise darkening on her cheekbone, and something in the old man's face finally, fully broke. Peace, then, he said quietly. God knows I'm too old and too tired to keep fighting a war my father started before I was even born. Good, Damien said. Then we're finished here. He turned, one arm wrapped protectively around Elena, and walked out of the warehouse into the cold October night, 30 years of inherited hatred finally, quietly laid to rest behind him, and felt, for the first time since his father's death, something that felt disturbingly, wonderfully, like the beginning of an actual future. The penthouse felt different with her in it, softer somehow, though nothing about the space itself had changed, the same severe modern lines and floor-to-ceiling glass, the same view of a city that had nearly cost Elena her life. Damien had insisted she stay there while she recovered, both physically and from the trauma of the kidnapping, and she had not had the energy or honestly the desire to argue. You don't have to hover, she said, 3 days after the warehouse, watching him pace the length of the living room for what felt like the 100th time that afternoon. I'm a doctor, Damien. I know how to assess my own injuries. The bruise is healing. I'm fine. You were tied to a chair and struck in the face by a man twice your age, Damien said, his voice tight with a guilt he had not fully set down since the moment he'd found her in that warehouse. You are not required to perform fine for my benefit. Elena studied him for a long moment, recognizing in his restless, guilt-ridden pacing something she saw often in family members of trauma patients, the particular helplessness of loving someone and being unable to undo the harm that had already been done to them. "Come here," she said quietly, patting the cushion beside her on the couch. He came, sitting close enough that his knee pressed against hers, his hands restless in his lap, until she reached over and stilled them with her own. "This isn't your fault," she said. "I brought you into a world that nearly got you killed. You brought me into your life, Damien. The world that nearly got me killed was built over 30 years by two men who are both, thankfully, no longer in a position to hurt anyone." She squeezed his hands. "I chose to stay that night at Aurelia, knowing exactly what danger might come with loving you. I don't regret that choice. I won't let you carry guilt for a choice that was mine to make. I should have ended things with Salvatore the moment I suspected he was investigating you. I waited too long, trying to handle it quietly instead of decisively, and it nearly cost you your life. You handled it exactly the way a careful, thoughtful man handles a war he doesn't want to start unnecessarily." Her voice was gentle but firm, the voice she used with patients who needed the truth delivered kindly but without softening the edges too much. "You made a judgment call with the information you had. It didn't go the way you hoped. That doesn't make you responsible for Salvatore Castellano's 30 years of hatred, Damien. That's on him, and only him." He was quiet for a long moment, studying their joined hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something rawer, more uncertain than she had ever heard from him. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you. I have spent 15 years building walls specifically so that nothing could ever hurt me the way losing my father hurt me. And then you walked into my life, and every single wall I built came down in about 6 weeks. And I don't—" He stopped, his jaw tight, something almost like fear moving behind his eyes. "I don't know how to protect you and love you fully at the same time, without one becoming an excuse for the other. My father never figured that out with my mother, and I watched it destroy them both slowly for 30 years, until she died still believing he'd stopped loving her somewhere along the way." Elena reached up, cupping his jaw the way he so often cupped hers, forcing his eyes to meet hers directly. "Then we figure it out together. That's the whole point, Damien. You don't have to have already solved every fear you carry before you're allowed to love someone. You just have to be willing to keep choosing honesty over silence every single day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple. It's just worth doing anyway." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, the way he had at Aurelia, the way he had in the warehouse, a gesture that had become, in the space of a few short weeks, entirely and uniquely theirs. "I fell in love with a dangerous man, Damien. I went into this with my eyes open. I'm not asking you to become someone safe. I'm asking you to keep choosing me honestly. The way you chose to walk into that warehouse alone, rather than risk my life with an army at your back." Something in his face broke open then, tenderness and relief, and a kind of desperate gratitude that made her chest ache. "I love you," he said quietly, "in a way I did not know I was capable of feeling for anyone. I would burn my whole empire down
before I let anyone take you from me again." "I know," Elena said softly. "I love you too, danger and all." He kissed her then, slow and searching, one hand cradling the back of her head with a gentleness that had become, over these last strange, dangerous weeks, entirely and unmistakably his particular language of love. And outside the penthouse windows, the city glittered on, indifferent and beautiful, holding within its skyline the quiet, fragile beginning of a peace that both of them intended, fiercely, to protect. 6 months passed the way seasons pass in the aftermath of survival. Slowly at first, marked by careful vigilance and the lingering echo of violence neither of them fully forgot, and then, gradually, with the quiet, accumulating ordinariness of two people learning how to build a life together, despite everything that had tried to prevent it. Salvatore Castellano kept his word. The peace held, brittle at first, then sturdier with each passing month, cemented finally by a formal territorial agreement that Vincent negotiated with the cold, careful precision of a man who understood that lasting peace required structure, not just goodwill. Anthony Castellano, humbled by his father's near-total collapse of authority, proved surprisingly amenable to a working relationship built on mutual restraint rather than inherited hatred. Antonio Ricci, for his part, had wept, actually wept, something Elena had seen her father do perhaps twice in her entire life, when Damien came to his kitchen table in Bensonhurst to ask, with old-fashioned formality that clearly moved the old surgeon more than he wanted to admit, for his blessing to marry his daughter. 31 years ago, Antonio said, his voice thick, gripping Damien's hand across the same table where he'd once told Elena the truth about a debt 3 decades in the making. "I saved a dying stranger because it was the only thing I knew how to do. I never imagined that stranger's son would one day save my daughter's life in return, and then asked to spend the rest of his own life loving her." He shook his head slowly, wonderingly. "Salvatore Marchetti told me that night that a debt like ours is never truly repaid, only honoured. I understand now, finally, exactly what he meant. I love her more than I have ever loved anything in my life," Damien said simply. "I intend to spend the rest of mine proving that to her, every single day. The way your family proved its worth to mine 3 decades before either of us was born." They married at Aurelia on a clear evening in April, the club transformed for one night into something soft and golden and entirely unlike its usual dangerous glamour. White flowers instead of dim velvet, candlelight instead of the calculated shadows Damien usually preferred for conducting business no one else was meant to witness. Vincent stood as best man, his usual careful composure cracking just slightly with unabashed emotion as he watched the man he'd served for 15 years finally, fully let himself be happy. Antonio walked his daughter down an aisle strewn with white peonies, the same flowers Damien had sent to the nurses' station all those months ago, a detail Elena had insisted on, with tears in her eyes when she remembered it. His weathered hands steady for once, with pure, uncomplicated joy. "You look," Damien said, as she reached him at the altar, his voice rough with an emotion he made no attempt to hide in front of the assembled crowd of family, capos, and the handful of hospital colleagues Elena had insisted on inviting, despite Vincent's nervous objections about mixing worlds. "Like every reason I have ever had to believe in something bigger than the empire I was born into."
"You look," Elena said, smiling through her own unexpected tears, "like a man who finally stopped running from the one thing that was always going to save him." "You already saved me once," he murmured, taking her hands in his. "Twice, if you count what your father did for mine 31 years ago." "Then let's call it even," she said softly, "and start counting all the ways we're going to save each other from here on out." They exchanged vows that were, by the standards of the world Damien had been born into, remarkably plain and unadorned. No mention of empires or territories, or the particular complicated inheritance of violence and gratitude that had brought them to this exact moment. Only the simple, fierce promise of two people who had each, in their own way, spent years believing love was a luxury too dangerous to permit themselves, choosing finally, deliberately, to permit it anyway. When Damien kissed his bride at the end of the ceremony, the assembled crowd, men who had spent their whole lives associated with violence and calculation, women who had learned to survive in a world that rarely offered them softness, erupted into something Aurelia's velvet walls had perhaps never quite witnessed before. Unguarded, uncomplicated celebration. Glasses raised not to power or fear or the careful maintenance of an empire, but to something far rarer in their world and far more valuable. To love, freely chosen, against every reasonable expectation of the lives both of them had been born into. 2 years later. The nursery in the Marchetti penthouse had blackout curtains and a rocking chair, positioned exactly where Elena could watch the sunrise over the East River while she fed their daughter in the small, quiet hours before the city fully woke, a detail Damien had insisted on, remembering, though he never said so directly, all those months he'd spent watching Elena run along that same river at dawn, alone, before he'd ever worked up the courage to properly enter her life. "She has your stubbornness already," Elena said one morning, laughing softly as their 6-month-old daughter, Sofia Antonia Marchetti, refused with fierce, red-faced determination to be soothed by anything except being held upright against her father's shoulder, exactly the position she preferred above all others. "She has your eyes," Damien said, pressing a kiss to the crown of Sophia's dark hair, the same gesture of unguarded tenderness that had once seemed, to the men who'd known him 15 years earlier, entirely impossible for the cold, controlled boss they'd feared and respected in equal measure. "God help the world when this one grows up. Your compassion and my stubbornness in one very small, very loud package." Mercy General's trauma wing bore, since 18 months earlier, a small brass plaque near the entrance that few patients ever noticed, but that Elena passed every single day on her way into work. Funding for the wing's complete renovation, provided anonymously through a foundation that the hospital administrators had, this time, been permitted to trace, dedicated in honour of Dr. Antonio Ricci, whose example taught an entire family the true meaning of a debt worth honouring. Elena had cut back her hours since Sophia's birth, though nothing in the world, not even love, not even the empire her husband had spent 2 years quietly, deliberately restructuring toward more legitimate business ventures with Vincent's careful guidance, could convince her to leave medicine entirely. She still worked 3 shifts a week in the ER, still ran toward gunshot wounds and cardiac arrests with the same fierce, uncompromising dedication that had first caught Damien's attention in a trauma bay 2 years before. Though now, when she came home exhausted after a difficult shift,
There was a husband waiting with dinner already made, and a daughter who lit up at the sight of her mother's face like nothing in the world could possibly be more important. Salvatore Castellano died peacefully 8 months after the wedding, in his own bed, of causes entirely unrelated to violence. An ending Damien had not expected to grant the old man any particular satisfaction, and yet found, somehow, that he did. A final, quiet proof that 30 years of inherited war truly could end in something other than blood.
Anthony Castellano, running his own territory now, with a caution his father had never quite managed, sent flowers to Sophia's christening. An olive branch that Damien accepted with the same measured grace his own father had once shown a young doctor who'd saved his life without asking a single question about what he was. Antonio Ricci, 71 years old now and finally fully retired from medicine, spent his Sundays exactly as he always had, except now the small kitchen table in Bensonhurst had a high chair pulled up beside it, and instead of quiet conversations about debts and gratitude, the room was filled with the particular chaos of a toddler's laughter and a grandfather's delighted, unguarded joy. 31 years ago, Antonio said one Sunday afternoon, watching Damien chase a shrieking, delighted Sophia around the small living room while Elena laughed from the kitchen doorway. I saved a dying man because it was the only thing I knew how to do. I never imagined, not once in all these years, that it would lead to this. Some debts, Damien said, scooping Sophia into his arms as she squealed with laughter, looking over at Elena with an expression of such open, unguarded love that Antonio felt his old heart ache with gratitude. Aren't really debts at all, in the end. They're just love, finding its way through 30 years of complicated circumstance to arrive exactly where it was always meant to be. Outside the kitchen window, the October afternoon was gold and mild, the same lace curtains stirring in the same old draught they always had, and Eleanor Ricci, doctor, wife, mother, the woman who had once saved a stranger's life without knowing his name, and found, in the saving, the whole unexpected shape of her own future, watched her husband and her daughter and her father, 3 generations of a debt finally, fully honoured and understood, with a certainty that settled deep and warm in her chest, that she had never once regretted the choice that had started it all. "Stay with me," she had whispered once to a dying stranger she did not yet know she loved. "Whoever you are, stay." He had. He always would.